You're standing on the dock, phone in your hand, staring at a listing that looks too good to be true. 30-something thousand dollars for a real cruising boat, teak trim, a solid diesel, a hull that's crossed oceans, and a little voice in your head is whispering, "This is my way in." I know that voice. I trusted it once, and it cost me almost everything I'd saved. Here's the truth I paid dearly to learn. There is no honest, cheap way into cruising boat ownership. The cheap ones aren't cheap because you got lucky. They're cheap because the last owner already found out what they cost, and he wants out before the next bill lands. I bought the wrong boat before I owned the right one, and the difference between them wasn't luck. It was 6 specific things nobody warned me about. So stay with me, because before we're done, I'm going to show you a trick you can use tonight from your couch, using nothing but the photos in the listing and a line a naval architect drew 50 years ago. It tells you if a boat is quietly full of water before you ever make a phone call. Whether this is your first cruising boat or your second, this one detail could save you $40,000. Let me take you back to the first mistake, because it set the pattern for everything else. The first boat that nearly broke me was a Morgan-out Island 41. Charlie Morgan drew her, and they built her in St. Petersburg, Florida in the middle 1970s. Wide, shallow draft, a center cockpit, a huge interior for the money. On paper, she was the perfect live-aboard cruiser, and the price was $38,000. I remember walking her decks the first time and feeling a little softness underfoot near the mast. I told myself it was the non-skid flexing. It wasn't. Those decks are balsa cord, and by the time a Morgan of that age reaches you, water has been creeping into that core through every deck fitting for 40 years. Every stanchion base, every cleat, every handrail bolt is a straw feeding water into the wood. Once balsa gets wet, it rots, and once it rots, the deck loses its stiffness. Walking mine felt like walking on a trampoline in the sun. I got a quote to fix it right: to cut open the deck, dig out the wet core, dry it, re-core it, and re-glass it. The yard wanted somewhere between $18,000 and $25,000 on a boat I paid $38,000 for. I did a lot of it myself over 2 seasons, and it still ate more than $20,000 and most of my weekends for 2 years. So here's what I want you to do before you fall for a wide, shallow center cockpit deal like I did. Walk every inch of the side decks and the foredeck in bare feet or soft soles. Push down hard beside every fitting. Feel for the give. Listen for the dull thud instead of a sharp knock. A wet deck sounds like a wet sponge and feels like one too. If it flexes, you are not buying a boat. You are buying a 2-year construction project that lives in your marina slip. But a soft deck is at least something you can feel with your own 2 feet. The next boat hit its damage somewhere you can't stand. The second boat is one almost every new shopper falls for, because there are thousands of them and they're always cheap. The production hunter, the ones built in Alachua, Florida, from the late 1970s through the 1990s. The Cherubini brothers styled the early ones, and they're genuinely pretty boats, roomy and bright below, and you can find a 30-something footer for well under $30,000 all day long. Here's what the glossy listing won't tell you. On a lot of these boats, the chain plates, the metal straps that hold your mast up, are bolted to plywood bulkheads down below. Water tracks down the mast, down the deck, down the chain plate slot, and it soaks into the top edge of that plywood bulkhead. Slowly, quietly, for years. You can't see it. It's buried behind a headliner and a teak trim strip. I looked at one of these as my second boat, and I almost wrote the check. What saved me was a surveyor I finally learned to pay for. He pulled back the trim, pushed an awl into the top of the main bulkhead where the chain plate landed, and the tool sank in like the wood was cheese. That bulkhead was rotten across the top edge. To fix it means dropping the rig, cutting out the old bulkhead, laminating a new one, and rebedding everything. $12,000 to $20,000, and your boat is out of commission for a season. So when you look at any production boat with chain plates that tie into interior bulkheads, do this. Follow the chain plate down from the deck with your eyes and your fingers. Look for rust weeping, black staining, or soft wood at the top of the bulkhead. Press an awl or even a car key firmly into that top edge. Firm wood resists, rotten wood gives. If it gives, walk away. because the whole thing that keeps your mast in the sky is standing in wet plywood. Therefore, the lesson was starting to sharpen for me. The cheap boat wasn't cheap. The cheap boat was a bill I hadn't opened yet. And the third boat taught me the bill can be built into the very bones of the hull. The third boat is the Irwin. Ted Irwin built boats in Clearwater, Florida, and he built a lot of them fast and affordable through the 1970s and 80s. The Irwin 37 and the Citation series show up cheap constantly. Big volume, tall rigs, comfortable interiors. And sailors who own the good ones love them. But Irwin built to a price, and that price shows up in two places. First, the decks. Same balsa and plywood core story, same soft spots, but Irwin's deck layups were on the light side, so they flex sooner and rot faster once water gets in. Second, and this is the one that scared me, the rigging and the chain plates were sometimes on the light side for the size of the rig. I talked to an owner at a dock in Florida who'd had a chain plate let go while sailing. Not the whole rig down, but close enough that his hand still shook telling me about it. Here's the number that matters and almost nobody budgets for. Standing rigging, the wire that holds your mast up, has a working life. Most surveyors and most insurance companies will tell you to replace it every 10 to 15 years, no matter how good it looks. Stainless steel wire fails from the inside out at the swage fittings where you cannot see the cracks with your eye. On a 37-footer, a full re-rig runs $8,000 to $15,000, sometimes more with new furling. Now think about a cheap Irwin from the 1980s. When was that rig last replaced? If the seller can't hand you a receipt with a date on it, you must assume it's original, and you must assume you're paying for a full re-rig the year you buy her. So ask for the rigging receipts in writing. Ask the date. Look at the swage fittings at the base of each wire for fine rust lines or hairline cracks. No paperwork means budget the full amount, because the alternative is your mast in the water on a Sunday afternoon, but standing rigging is at least a known, published number. The fourth boat hides its cost in a place buyers actively talk themselves out of checking because they think this particular model is the safe one. The fourth boat is the Catalina 30. Frank Butler's company built more of these than almost any other cruising boat in America, starting in 1972 and running for decades. They're everywhere. They're cheap, parts are easy, and there's a huge owner's community. That popularity is exactly the trap. Buyers tell themselves, it's a Catalina, everybody has one, it's a safe, cheap buy, I don't even need a real survey. That sentence has emptied more wallets than any leaky deck. The Catalina 30 has two specific quirks you must check. The first is the keel smile. The keel is bolted to the hull, and over years of groundings and flexing, a crack opens along the joint where the keel meets the hull. It looks like a thin smile in the paint. Sometimes it's cosmetic. Sometimes it means the keel bolts are weeping and the hull is stressed around them. Rebedding and retorquing a keel, or worse, dealing with corroded keel bolts, can run from a couple thousand into the five-figure range if the yard has to drop the keel. The second is the original rudder. Water gets inside the fiberglass rudder shell, sits on the internal steel frame, and rusts it. On a cold morning, that water can freeze, expand, and split the rudder open. I've seen rudders come off boats looking fine on the outside and pouring rust-colored water out the bottom. So here is what you do, and it costs nothing. On the keel joint, look closely at the paint line where the keel meets the hull for cracking or repeated filler. On the rudder, grab it and try to move it side to side and fore and aft. Play or a knocking feel means worn bearings or a rusted frame. Tap the rudder with your knuckle from top to bottom and listen. A sharp knock is solid glass. A dull, deadened sound is water trapped inside. Cheap and famous does not mean safe. It just means the problems are famous too, if you bother to look. Now, before I get to the fifth boat, I need to stop and talk directly to the people watching who already own a cruising boat. Maybe you clicked thinking this was only for first-time buyers, and you already have your boat in a slip somewhere. Stay with me, because this next part is for you specifically, and you can do it this weekend without a broker, without a haul out, and without spending a dime. Here's the thing I wish someone had told me while I still owned my problem boats instead of after I sold them. Every fitting on your deck is a potential leak, and most owners never rebed a single one until water is already dripping on their charts. So this weekend, go down to your boat and do a slow, deliberate inspection of the deck hardware you walk past every day. Start with the chain plate covers. Look for rust stains, dark streaks, or cracked sealant. Then go to every stanchion base, every cleat, every Genoa track, every handrail bolt. Press down beside each one and feel for softness. Look for hairline cracks in the gel coat radiating out from bolts, because that pattern means the fitting is working loose and letting water in. Then go below and get into the spaces you never open. Open the lockers under the settees and berths and put your hand flat on the inside of the hull down low near the turn of the bilge. Is it dry or is it damp and cold? Sniff it. A musty, swampy smell in an enclosed locker means water is getting in and not getting out. Check the base of the mast if it's deck stepped and the bulkhead beside it for staining and softness. None of this costs anything but an afternoon, and finding one weeping chain plate now and rebedding it with fresh sealant is a $40 tube of caulk instead of a $20,000 bulkhead job in 5 years. You already made the smart move buying a boat. This is how you keep her from quietly turning into one of the boats I'm warning you about. Everything I've just walked you through, the soft decks, the rotten bulkheads, the chain plate standing in wet plywood, I went deeper on all of it in the books I wrote specifically for buyers who refuse to learn these lessons the hard way. Sail Smart, Deep Water, and Sail Clear. Each cover a different stage of the cruising life, from choosing your first boat to sailing her offshore with confidence, and they're available in the description below. If you'd rather spend an afternoon with one of those books than 2 years fixing a boat you should never have bought, that's the trade I'd make every single time. Now, therefore, let me show you the fifth boat, because this one fools the most careful buyers of all, the ones who did their homework and fell for the myth anyway. The fifth boat is the Westsail 32. If you've spent any time reading about cheap blue water boats, you know this one. Her lines trace back to the double enders of William Atkin, drawn from the old Colin Archer rescue boat tradition, and William Crelock finalized the design that Westsail built in Costa Mesa, California in the early 1970s. A famous magazine story turned her into a legend, the affordable boat that could take you anywhere. You can find them today under $30,000, and the hulls are genuinely thick, hand-laid solid fiberglass, built like a bank vault. So, where's the catch? I almost bought one, so let me tell you exactly what the legend leaves out. She is heavy and she is slow. A displacement that high means she needs real wind to move, and in light air you will motor for days, burning fuel and patience. But the money problem isn't the sailing. It's that a cheap Westsail has usually been sitting half-finished for years, because owners run out of money before they finish her out. The hull is bulletproof, but everything attached to it is what bleeds you. 2 costs specifically. First, blisters. Those early 1970s hulls were laid up in polyester resin before builders switched to blister-resistant materials, so many of them develop osmotic blisters below the waterline. A proper blister job, peeling the gel coat, drying the hull for months, and recoating it, runs $10,000 to $20,000. Second, the interior and systems. A Westsail's charm is her joinery, and if a previous owner tore it apart for a refit that never finished, you are rebuilding a boat's entire interior, engine, tankage, and rig by hand. So when a heavy so-called blue water bargain shows up, look past the romance. Ask when she last sailed, not just when she last floated. Ask to see the bottom, and look for a rash of small bumps or ground-out repair spots below the waterline that signal past blistering. Ask whether the interior is complete and the engine runs under load. A cheap legend that's been sitting is not a discount. It's an unfinished project that already defeated the last dreamer who owned her, but the Westsail at least warns you with her price and her reputation. The sixth boat is the most dangerous of all, because it sells you a dream so big you stop counting. The sixth boat is the big center cockpit cruiser you promise yourself you'll retire on. I'll use the Gulf Star as my example. The 50s and 40-somethings that Vince Lazara built in Florida through the 1970s and early 80s. Huge aft cabins, walk-in engine rooms, the kind of interior that makes you feel like you've already made it. And here's the hook that gets people. A 50-foot Gulf Star can sell for less than a well-kept 30-footer, sometimes under $40,000. Your brain does the math. More boat, less money. It feels like winning. It is not winning. It is the most expensive mistake in this entire video, and I watched a friend live it, so I didn't have to. Everything on a big boat costs big boat money, and a 50-footer has more of everything to fail. Start with the teak decks. Those beautiful teak overlays are screwed down through the deck with hundreds of fasteners, and after 40 years the teak is thin, and every screw hole is a leak into the core below. Ripping off old teak decks and repairing what's underneath on a boat that size can run $20,000 to $40,000 by itself. Then the tanks, and this is the one that ends dreams. Big older boats have big metal fuel and water tanks, often steel or aluminum, built in under the cabin sole and the settees before the interior was finished around them. After decades, they corrode and start to weep. To replace a tank, you often have to cut apart the furniture, sometimes the sole, to get the old one out and a new one in. On a big boat, that's a $10,000 to $20,000 job per tank, and there might be several. Add the rigging, the ground tackle, the sails, the two heads, the refrigeration, and haul-out fees that scale with length, and the $40,000 bargain becomes a $100,000 hole in the water. So when a huge cheap boat whispers that you can finally afford the dream, ask the hard question. Not what does she cost to buy, but what does she cost to own for 1 year, haul-out, insurance, dockage, and the running repairs on twice as many systems as a smaller boat. Then ask the seller the single most revealing question there is. Have the fuel and water tanks ever been replaced, and can I see them? Watch his face. Because if those original tanks are still buried under the furniture, you are one weep away from tearing the boat apart. And that question about the tanks, about what's hidden under the floor and behind the joinery, leads me straight to the thing I promised you at the start. The one check that beats all the others that you can do tonight before you ever pick up the phone. Here's how I found it. After the Morgan, after the wet decks and the drained savings, I got obsessed with one question. How do the good buyers spot a waterlogged boat before they waste a weekend driving to see it? And an old surveyor, the kind who's been crawling through bilges since the 1970s, told me something that stopped me cold. He said, every one of these boats was drawn by a naval architect who marked exactly where she was supposed to float. That line is on the original design drawings. It's called the designed water line, and the builder painted the boot stripe to match it. The boot stripe is that narrow band of color right at the water's edge. Here's the secret. When a fiberglass boat soaks up water into her core, her decks, her waterlogged rudder, her rotten bulkheads, and when owners pile on years of gear, extra batteries, tools, spares, and junk, she gets heavier. And a heavier boat sits deeper. She settles below the line her designer drew for her. So if you look at a boat floating at her dock and the water is riding up above the boot stripe, licking at the hull paint instead of sitting at the bottom of that painted band, that boat is carrying weight she was never meant to carry. Some of that weight is water. Trapped, rotting, expensive water. And this is the part that feels almost unfair to the sellers. You don't need to be there to see it. Almost every listing has a photo of the boat in the water, floating at her slip or on a mooring. Pull up that photo tonight. Find the boot stripe. Look at where the actual water line sits against it. If the water is up over the top of the boot stripe, or the stripe is completely underwater at the stern, that is your first hard evidence that the boat is heavy, tired, and probably wet inside. The designer told you where she should float half a century ago. The camera just told you where she actually floats. The gap between those two lines is the money you're about to spend. I've used this on dozens of listings since. It has saved me from driving hundreds of miles to look at boats that were quietly full of water, and it cost me nothing but a careful look at a photo the seller posted himself. The seller had every reason to hope you'd never notice that line. The designer drew it in good faith 50 years ago, and now you're the one holding it. Before you drive anywhere, before you pay for a survey, before you fall in love, put the listing photo up on your big screen and read the waterline. It will not catch everything, but it will catch the worst ones before they catch you. I need you to feel something as we close this out. That flutter of excitement you get looking at a cheap boat listing, that voice that says, this is finally my chance, that is the exact feeling that cost me 2 years and more than $40,000 on a Morgan with decks like a trampoline. The cheap boat is never the gift it pretends to be, but now you know where the bodies are buried. and that knowledge is the difference between a boat that carries you to your dreams and one that drags your savings to the bottom. You're not the kind of buyer who writes a check on a feeling. You're the kind who does the homework before the money moves, who reads the waterline before he reads the price. That's why you made it to the end of this while everyone else clicked away to the next pretty listing. So tell me one thing in the comments. Which boat are you looking at right now? The one that's got its hooks in you? The one you keep going back to at night? Name the model and the year, and tell me where you're watching from. If it's one of these 6, I want to know, and I'll tell you straight what to check first. Don't just think it, type it, because I read these, and the boat you name might be the one I warn the next person about. And if you refuse to be the guy who finds out what a cheap boat costs after the money's gone, subscribe and stand with the rest of us who do the homework first. Next time I'm pulling apart the boats everyone calls safe blue water bargains, and I'm going to show you the one bulkhead detail on a famous full keel cruiser that surveyors quietly dread, the one that decides whether she's worth $30,000 or worth nothing at all. Read the waterline, trust the receipts, and never let a cheap price tell you what a boat is worth. You're still here, so you want the real detail. That's exactly what I save for members of the Cruising Compass. Inside, I continue this very survey, fitting by fitting, right where we stopped. Ask me your own question, and I answer you myself. Not some robot. You'd be joining thousands of sailboat buyers just like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime, one click, no risk. I'm Marcus. Come on in,